Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, and we have a brand new guest on the podcast. I am talking to Dan Shuna today all about Firestarter, the novel, and we are going to be diving into that momentarily. But Dan, I just wanted to welcome you to the podcast since it is your first time. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you very much for having me on. This is one of my favorite Stephen King novels, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Of course. And I know you are also a big Stephen King fan, so I sort of just want to quickly discuss how you started getting into his novels and everything, since, like I said, this is your first episode, and obviously talking about one of your favorites right off the bat is a pretty big deal here. So,
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, Stephen King, the first time I was aware of him because my mom used to read him fairly regularly. The first time I really had access to it was early 90s at junior high. Our junior high library had the entire catalog of Stephen King novels that had been released at that time, which, I mean, going back and reading them now is, I don't know that that was necessarily appropriate for some of them,
yeah.
but and so that's where I first got access to it. And so being that age, I would check them out from the library, and even then, I kind of knew that maybe I wasn't super supposed to be reading this, but I was anyway, and so there was that element of transgression. I'm doing something that I'm not supposed to. I'm reading this. But that was my first experience with him, was like reading his short story collections, Skeleton Crew, things like that. But what really hooked me on him is when I was in early high school, I picked up the Dark Tower books. And something about that, the originality of it, and just the broad scope of what he set out to do in the beginning was just staggering to me. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. So it really pulled me in. The mixes of genres and the character development, and then finding out later that he's pulling in influences and events from his other novels, which are great on their own and stand alone as their own great works. But just knowing that all of that has been pulled in, and seeing where that's going really hooked me in and got me to read his bigger catalog.
And it is certainly a very large catalog, as we're going to find out with this podcast, especially since, I plan to cover adaptations as well. That sort of just expands it even more. And with Firestarter here, one of the first things I want to discuss is the pacing of the book, because this is a book that is over 400 pages long. Some of his earlier books were a little shorter, and like you mentioned, short story collections are a big part of his writings as well. You have
Mm-hmm.
Night Shift as one of the early short story collections there, but
Yep.
with this, you sort of just have this really character driven story, and I would say a lot of his books are that way, especially the ones that are named after characters like Carrie. Obviously, that's going to be a character driven one and everything like this. But
Right.
here he is focusing on a child. And I think that sort of makes it so that you pace it a little differently, because Charlie McGee is even, younger than Carrie was when Stephen King created that character. She was in high school and everything. But you have this father daughter pair on the run from a government agency. So, being on the run, you're going to have moments where it feels like they sort of fly by, because you're just so engrossed in where these two are going, how they get there, and if they're going to be able to continue to get away from the shop, which is the name of the government agency. So, what did you think of the pacing of the novel? Because I thought it was fairly well paced. It was one that was able to keep my attention just because of sort of the premise of it.
Right. Well, I guess it's, to me, if I kind of look at it almost like it is two short novels. The reason being, like, the first half of it is very much it's a chase story, and all it's very paranoid feeling, the sort of looking over your shoulder. And then the second half of the novel is them at the shop, and it takes place, they've been in, it starts with them having been in custody for a few months at this point. So to me it's almost like broken up into two separate pieces, which is interesting for a novel of that length, but I feel like King works so well in the short story and novella range that the idea of structuring it like two connected novellas ended up serving the story really well.
Absolutely. I don't want to spend too much time on the pacing simply because there are so many other important aspects of this book. So,
Sure.
we can go ahead and move on to the family dynamic. You have this father daughter pair, and it's obvious that, Andy sort of knows that there's something fishy going on, and he is very aware of his daughter as well, I think, for the most part throughout this book, which helps with her developing these powers even more because, kids are not able to control their actions as much as adults are. And we've seen in King's previous work how when someone has powers, they freak out when they first find out about them, obviously, which is a perfectly normal reaction, I would imagine, if anyone
Right.
in the real world could ever have powers, So it's like, okay,
Right.
that's understandable.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in his earlier work, like he ties that the powers piece of it to various coming of age stories. So it's interesting to me because as a kid coming up, like when you're in junior high and high school, you're very emotional, and this is when he has set these characters, I guess, fully starting to realize and blossom in their powers. So to have that on top of the regular struggles of growing up in that age group, now you've also added this complex thing to the mix, which in both the case of Firestarter and Carrie, is the power to kill people wantonly, if that's what it comes down to. And so to throw that into an already emotional, difficult period, now they've also got this on top of it, I think it really makes it a very multi-layered struggle, and it makes the characters seem more sympathetic to me.
Plus, you have the aspect of Andy also having powers. So I think that gives you an even deeper connection between these two characters. It's a little more than your typical father-daughter relationship because of the special circumstances, and
Right.
he has this psychic flash while he's at work, and he finds his wife murdered at home and Charlie is just gone. So that's sort of the setup for how we got to them being on the run. Obviously, a lot happens in between that, which we will definitely get into. But just the fact that, you have them on the run, but then you're sort of piecing together the full story along the way. I think that really helps show you what the family dynamic is between these two characters. And it's really well done. Sometimes it's a little iffy with me when books sort of go back and forth between time periods, basically. It's like, okay,
Right.
sometimes that's a little too much to keep track of. You're like, can you just give this to me a little more linearly?
Right. Right. I agree with that. I think that it's interesting to, before you know this family's history, you're immediately thrown into seeing them coping with crisis. The entire book, these characters are in crisis management, and I think that that's something that can really stress families out. And so it's interesting, and I think it's an interesting challenge that he laid for himself to have our almost our entire experience with these two as family members is seeing how they support each other, because there's times too when Andy is weak and Charlie is supporting him. So I mean, they've both kind of learned to pick it up and care for one another, and it's obviously for Andy, that's what you do as a parent. But I think for Charlie, who's an 8-year-old girl, being forced to come to cope with the idea that like you need to protect and support your dad, who is a figure as an 8-year-old who has been protecting and supporting you. So it kind of sets up this, it kind of forces her into this difficult place where, you know, you recognize your parents as people, and you know, you both develop to be there for each other. I think it really forced their relationship, their father-daughter relationship, to mature much more quickly than it may have otherwise.
Absolutely. It's one of those things, too, that shows you how resilient children can be. And we see that a lot with Charlie, especially under the various circumstances. You know, at one point she's taken, like I mentioned, and then at another point she's on the run with her dad. And it's like, okay, these are very high stress situations for literally anyone, but to put a
Right.
child in them, it gives you all of these unpredictable variables on top of, you know, Andy already trying to figure things out. He has this child with powers. Obviously, he has his own powers as well, but at any moment, she could probably just completely go off. And we get small glimpses of that when they're on the run. You know, she accidentally sets some things on fire
Right.
and he sort of has to quickly cover it up. I believe one of the instances was in a phone booth or at a phone or something like that in public. And he was
Yeah.
like, oh, crap, gotta deal with this.
Yeah, he sent her to go get the change from the public phone booths.
Yeah.
And she ended up setting a soldier's feet on fire, I believe, as a result of it. So yeah, I mean, in those moments, yeah, it pulls that off quite well.
I know one of the other things you wanted to talk about while we're sort of on the topic of characters here is John Rainbird, and he is the hitman who is sent by the shop to capture both Andy and Charlie. And they are able to capture them, but then he sort of becomes very interested in what Charlie is able to do, and he just ends up being completely obsessed with her. And it's one of those things where, one, he's already a hitman, which is bad enough, but then he sort of creepily becomes obsessed with this child just because of her abilities, and he still wants to kill her on top of that. So you just
Right.
sort of have this whole dynamic between those two characters as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting how they set it up where he is ends up being well, he tries to position himself. I mean, later on in the book, he ends up he gaslights her. It's pretty wild how they set that up. They spend the first half of the book setting up a relationship with her dad. They take the dad away, and then this guy comes in and just super manipulative, absolutely psychotic, and comes in and tries to fill this daddy role into manipulating her, all so that he can, you know, I don't know if it is. Am I spoilering it too much?
No, total spoilers
Okay.
are fine on this.
Okay, I guess it. I mean, the book came out in 1980. Spoiler
Yeah.
alert for a book that came out, you know, 38 years ago. But no, I mean, it's all so that he can look into her eyes as he kills her. So now I don't know about you, but I have really mixed feelings about John Rainbird. I feel like he's halfway there to a full character. But I feel like his core motivations, that basically he's dead inside and he's looking for something in somebody's eyes when he kills them. I feel like at the end of the day, for me, that kind of feels a little bit hollow, especially for a king bad guy. Now, I understand it's his earlier work and that needs to be taken into account. But just like how he built the character, I guess, to me, like I was wanting more. Like I didn't really connect with him. I didn't find him super menacing because he kind of felt a little two-dimensional. What did you think about how he drew that character?
I think it's one of those things where a lot of his early works are definitely a product of the time, and some are a little more forward thinking than others, but I do agree with you on this one where it fell a little flat. I was always way more interested in what Charlie was doing than pretty
Right.
much anyone else. So when her dad was taken away, obviously she continued to want to see her dad, but it's like, you know, you have the bad guys, so to speak, and they're only half being bad. I don't know. It's one of those things where it's like, okay, what exactly is their goal? Because if you're going to kill her in the end, why are you doing all of this beforehand, especially for a hitman, too. That seems very strange. Usually, a hitman is, I mean, like you said, a somewhat two dimensional character. They're usually given an order and they go carry it out, and that's their job.
Right, absolutely. There's very little that you know about him. What you know about him is very surface, and when it gets to the core of him, it's hollow. He's dead inside, and I mean, it's pretty horrific that he's gaslighting an 8-year-old girl so that at the end of the day he can like stare into her eyes while he kills her. Like, obviously, the actions that he does are sufficiently horrific for a horror novel. I guess my gripe with him is that, like, yeah, like you said, like at the end of the day, like his core motivation, I mean, what is it? It just kind of it seems vague and just kind of rings a little bit hollow in the end. He's still menacing, but like he's not super compelling or interesting to me. And I'm not really in a position to call yes or no, but like, what did you think? Like, to me, this kind of seems like there were times when it felt a little bit racist. Little bit racist.
I have certainly felt that in various works of his, especially, like I said, the older ones where they are a product of the time. And it's obviously something that's still a problem today, even. So I don't know if that's saying too much. But as far as Stephen King's books go, I something did feel off with the character, but I don't know if he was necessarily intentionally being racist because that was how he felt, or just because,
Right.
of this still being in the 80s. And well, it was very, very early because it came out in 1980. So it's one of those things where I do think it was more a product of the time, I would say, because I think we've seen, obviously, through social media and everything, Stephen King is not a guy who puts up with racism. And in obviously a fictional story from 1980, that's something that, okay, maybe this sort of depiction of this man who was a Cherokee and a Vietnam veteran was sort of just how they were looked at the time.
Right. Yeah. I guess that makes sense.
I think Rainbird is just one of those characters who is meant to be the bad guy, and we're not really meant to like him or necessarily have more of an interest in him either. I think
Right.
Charlie is obviously such a huge focus in this book that it's like, okay, here's how Charlie reacts when someone tries to do this, and this to her.
Right. That
So
makes sense.
I think John Rainbird serves more as a vehicle for getting a reaction out of Charlie. And I think in that sense, the character works pretty well.
Right. That's a good point. He does serve a purpose. I guess for the amount of time that we spend with him in the book, I guess I was kind of hoping for a little bit more depth.
Yeah.
But I do agree with you. I mean, he serves his purpose for what he's in the story to do. Absolutely.
Let's talk about the horror aspect of this novel as well, because I feel like with Stephen King novels, you can have the straight horror novels, something like It and everything like that, but then you have ones
Right.
that sort of have this more supernatural element to it, like Carrie and Firestarter, where, these people have powers and it sort of adds a different sort of horror to it, I think. I don't think there's necessarily one way to write a horror novel. If there was, I don't know if Stephen King would still be writing horror novels today, because he
Right.
probably would have been pretty bored with writing the same kind of horror novel over and over again. But,
Right.
this, I think it felt a little more like a thriller novel, I guess, to me, just because you have the government aspect, being on the run, and then you have this sort of supernatural twist, but you still have these horrors that happen throughout it, when Charlie is taken and she's being held and everything like that. So you do still get that horror aspect to it. But I think because this is more realistic aside from the powers, that's sort of what makes it more of a horror novel. It's like, okay, yeah, we could easily envision someone taking away a child because they thought they were special.
Yeah, that's That's an interesting point because the main conceit of it, the powers, it's like you mentioned, Carrie as well. If you look at the Dead Zone, is another one where it's these people have these incredible powers, and these are the consequences thereof. It's a hallmark of his earlier work, I feel like, and maybe not so much in his more modern work, although I haven't read all of his newer stuff. But I think it's a hallmark of his earlier work that the horror doesn't necessarily come from an outside source. There are threats and there are menaces from an outside source, but ultimately, it's these people learning to deal with these powers that they have, and it never works out well because his early stuff is super bleak. But I feel like at the end of the day, it's about these people trying to deal with the costs of these powers. In Carrie, well, okay, Carrie's maybe not about her dealing with it. Maybe it's about her indulging it. But at least in the Dead Zone and in Firestarter, there are consequences to these powers that they have, right? I mean, Andy gets these splitting headaches and he gets, stroke-like symptoms. I mean, his face is going numb. His eyes are all bloodshot. Charlie, her price is that when she indulges this, it feels great. And she has a really difficult time stopping. And again, I mean, she's an 8-year-old girl. So think about an 8-year-old set loose in a candy shop. Everything's amazing. Everything feels great. And then expecting them to limit themselves and be reasonable with what they're doing. That's their cost, for what they have. And I think that that's crucial for a balance in order for it to really make sense in, like you said, the thriller milieu, where it's more of a, I don't necessarily want to say realistic, but it's a little less fantastic maybe, is that there needs to be a cost imposed for these powers. Otherwise it's, we're now in kind of in comic book land. And I feel like in his early work, the horror stems from those people figuring out how to balance the cost with the gifts or curses that they have been given or put upon.
Right. As far as the government goes, too, do you feel sort of that paranoia about the government is a good driving force in this novel? Because it's something we see a lot, especially, you mentioned comics real quick. And I think, when you have something like in the Marvel universe, you have the mutants and the Inhumans and everything like that. And the government sort of just tries to put them down and get rid of them. In a sense, that sort of is what's happening here. You have the shop going after Andy and Charlie because of what they're able to do. And it really just sort of gives Andy just enough paranoia to keep him going as long as possible until obviously they get captured and can't anymore. But even then,
Right.
they're separated for 6 months, Andy and Charlie, and they still sort of manage to get a different outcome in the end than what was set for them. And I really think Stephen King did a nice job here of letting that paranoia drive Andy so much to where he was like, I am going to survive. We are going to be reunited. And it sort of just kept fueling him throughout the story.
Yeah, I feel like by the end he's very much what, by the time that they're leaving the cabin right before they get caught, they're you very much get the feeling of hunted animal. He is at that point, you look over your shoulder, you see people in the street, you wonder, are they looking at you too much? And it's, one of the reasons that this, I really connected with this is that I read it when I was in early high school. I was a really big fan of the X-Files. That's probably going to date me, but I was a really big fan of the X-Files and all that. And so like the element of government paranoia and like the pyrokinesis and stuff like that, like just really connected with me. And it was interesting that this came out in, 1980. So it's kind of a theme that has been with thrillers. And to me, it's this piece, the paranoia about the government is where we start to see Stephen King's politics kind of leaking out into his work. I feel like we get a very good idea how he talks about bureaucracy and how he depicts the shop baddies in this. I feel like it tells us an awful lot about how at least young Stephen King felt about the government at that time, which is fun.
Plus, like I said earlier, now we have social media and we get to know his thoughts about the government pretty much all the time now. So it's interesting how something from so early on in his career sort of comes back around. But while we're on the topic of the government, this is another book where we see the government cover up at the end of the novel. And, they do their press releases, make their statements, and it's labeled as a terrorist firebomb attack. So basically, they don't want anyone knowing that they had this little girl locked up with powers, and she's the real reason all of this happened, because that would look very, very bad for the government. And I think, someone with powers like that would send the general public into more of a panic than just saying it was a firebomb attack.
Right. I mean, I agree with that up to a point, but I would say that I feel like there should be less. The way that he draws it, anyway, my takeaway from it is I feel like that there should be less, I guess, benevolent benefit of the doubt placed on the role of the government in these books. The feeling that I got from him in both, like the end of Carrie and the end of this one, is that it's that distrust it's more for him. It's more about these people being callous and emotionless enough to sweep this horrific thing under the rug.
True.
So that they personally can avoid the consequences from it. I feel like it's more that than that. They want to protect the public from really anything. I don't get that off the shop.
Right. And we sort of have that same thing at the end of Carrie, where the government covers it up and the town just basically ends up being desolate for years to come. While that isn't the same exact case in Firestarter, it is a similar premise as far as the cover up goes. And one of the things we haven't talked about just yet is the Manders. And I just want to quickly discuss them because, they lose a lot in this because of Charlie, and yet it's one of those things where they understand why it is important to help her, and you can tell they don't really like the government either, so that's sort of what ultimately leads to them being like, okay, all right, we'll do this. And we see her return to the Manders farm, and that's when the chaos goes down and she is able to get out of there and just heads to Rolling Stone magazine, apparently. So, that's an interesting choice there. But it's one of those things where you have these people sort of living in a more rural area. It's not like they have neighbors 10, 20 feet away from them. They have a good chunk of land, and these random people just come up to their house, and understandably they're a little skeptical at first, and who wouldn't be, especially in a place like that where you're like, all right, we know you didn't come from around here. So
well, and I mean, yeah, and it's old man Manders picked him up hitchhiking, I mean, here's this guy and his daughter hitchhiking.
Yeah.
So it's, they didn't just like show up. He's like, oh, I'll pick him up and bring him home. So,
yeah, they just show up in the area, though. So it's one of those things where it's like, okay, you guys clearly aren't from around here and don't really know what's going on. So I'm going to take you back. And then it's like they still have sort of this skepticism about them, though, especially as Andy, I think, tries to somewhat explain things, but not really explain things. And obviously it's to the point for Andy where he probably has to tell so many lies that they're kind of just all getting mixed up. At least I would imagine that's what he feels like in that moment.
Yeah, no, he totally tries to bullshit him, and like both of those Manders folk, like I don't remember their names, but like both of them are, neither one of them's buying it, like from day one.
Yeah.
From right out the gate. But like the important thing about those characters is that they don't care. Like what they see is, this guy down on his luck with a little girl. And I feel like if Andy were by himself, like Manders probably would have passed him by.
Right.
I feel like for them it was Charlie that made the difference, and that got them involved, and that kept them involved.
Yeah. I think too with this book you have a pretty high body count. And once all of the government men start showing up at the Manders farm, obviously something is going to click with them. They're like, all
Right.
right, this is serious. And obviously, it's still important for Charlie to continue to be protected. And I think the book does a really nice job of portraying that throughout the novel, even in times like this where it's not quite as chaotic as the book gets, but it's pretty close at that point. I would say, the barn situation is probably the biggest action bit in here. And then shortly thereafter, the Manders farm.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's it's it's a taste of he's got to show you at some point what the stakes are, and what it is that she's running for. And I think that's a really interesting way that he does that, the way the action is paced in this, where, I mean, when you think about it, like the Manders farm and the shop are the only two real, I guess, quote unquote, action scenes, like scenes where she really tears loose with her power.
Right.
I feel like that was a really good choice on his part from a storytelling perspective, because it keeps you hungry for it, and it makes the ending that much more powerful. So just again, kind of going back to the pacing, like the Manders farm, it's placed in a very, I guess, particular place in the story, and it's notice that it's not where they get caught, which is what you would assume typically if you're watching a movie or something like that. Like the big action scene would be, the first one would be where they get caught, and the end is where they escape.
Yeah. I know you also want to discuss the character growth for specifically Charlie throughout this novel, because it's one of those things where it's a somewhat long time period, because we know they go 6 months without seeing each other, Charlie and Andy do. So
Right.
there's a good chunk of time that passes throughout this novel. And, let's say it's, I don't know, 7, 8 months, because you figure they've probably been on the
Right.
run for a few weeks and everything like that. But you have this girl who obviously can stay calm at certain moments, but then when she unleashes her power, she doesn't really know how to control it. And, we didn't really
Right.
see any of that end up being put to the test, I guess you can say, throughout this novel, because it felt like where we begin with Charlie is sort of the same as where we end with her as far as her abilities and everything go. Obviously, we see the extent of them, but there's still that lack of control aspect. And I think, she is becoming more and more aware of just how much damage she can do. But I think because of where the story ends, we don't really get to see if she ultimately ends up controlling it. She decides to go to Rolling Stone and wants to tell them her story, and that's where the book ends. So it's like, okay, we don't know what exactly she told them or how she sort of portrayed everything that had happened to her, because she's still just a kid.
Yeah, to me, it just didn't. We do see her grow a little bit. Obviously, I mean, at the end, it is a King book, so at the end, she's not the same person that she was
Right.
in the beginning. I guess I just kind of wanted a little bit more in her head when they were in the shop, because I guess I mean, it's probably really hard to write. I mean, if you're Stephen King, like, how old was he when you wrote this? Like, late 20s, maybe early 30s. How do you write an 8-year-old girl like going through this? You know what I mean? So I mean, I feel like he did what he could with it, and I agree with you. Like, she is, I like the ending. I like how she is now making decisions for herself. She is being assertive. Her destiny is in her hands, not in anybody else's. She is now as self-sufficient as she possibly can be. And I think that that's a great place for the character to end up. I feel like she just kind of arrives there from a development pacing standpoint. I feel like she arrives there with a screech and a halt right at the end. I feel like we have right up until the end, I feel like we have mostly the same Charlie all the way through, except based on her actions and her behavior and her usage of the power, like we should see her changing through this, is, I guess I just kind of want a little bit more of that. But where she ends up is great. I really like the ending of this.
I think children characters are just a little hard to write in general too. I mean, I have not tried it myself,
Right.
but I imagine as an adult, especially as a male trying to write this character who would have experiences that you would not have experienced, especially, not only just her being a female versus a younger boy that, Stephen King could more easily relate to. She has these powers
Right.
that, no one can relate to. So when you're working with fiction, I think you do have a little more leeway with how you write
Right.
characters just because it doesn't always need to be 100% realistic, obviously. We wouldn't have a fantasy or a sci fi genre if that were the case.
Oh yeah, no, it absolutely, like I'm sorry, I'm not trying to nitpick.
Oh, no, you are welcome to. I just think, kids are generally harder to write, especially for,
Oh,
a
absolutely.
white male author. And it's one of those things where I
Absolutely.
think it takes him a while to sort of get that nailed down. I think, I haven't read it just yet, but I have seen both versions of the movie.
Oh,
So,
you haven't read it yet?
yeah, like I said, I have a lot to catch up on.
You're going to before the It episode, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, you are in for a treat. I wish I could read it again for the first time. You're lucky.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, I started this because I was starting to get into the books more.
Okay.
And I haven't read or watched everything. It's going to be a process for me as I go. And, obviously, I am recording these fairly ahead of time.
Right. Yeah. No. Hey, you gotta have a backlog.
Yeah.
That gives you time to catch up. Do the ones that you've read already and seen already first, and then like hang on. That's your bank,
Yeah.
and then you can start working through. Have you read the Dark Tower ones? Sorry, not to get too off topic, but
Did I read The Gunslinger? I think I intended to read The Gunslinger and didn't get to it yet. But, I have read The Stand, which is sort of the very, very beginnings of The Dark Tower. So I do have that under my belt at least, which is another large book of
okay.
his. So, yeah,
Oh
it
yeah.
is
No.
a lengthy process here at Chat Cemetery.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and the stand is definitely one you can put up on the chalkboard. Like, yep, I read that
Yeah,
one, like
yeah,
all 1,100 pages of it, and and it's worth it too. It's not just like, hey, look how many pages I read. Like, it's a great story, and it's totally worth it.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you're in for a treat with the Dark Tower too. So, but yeah, I'm sorry. Back on topic. I didn't mean
Tangents
to
are
sidebar.
very welcome on all of my
Okay,
podcasts. They happen a
cool.
lot.
Yeah,
But
tangents must happen.
yeah, but for Firestarter, I did like this book. I don't think it was necessarily one of my favorites. I think, like I said, it was sort of him warming up to the idea of writing these children characters a little more. And it's not, it's not a bad book by any means. I enjoyed reading it. I don't know if I've read any of his books that I just flat out haven't liked yet. So, and I don't know if that will necessarily happen. We'll see.
I
We'll
hope
find out
not.
along the way, but I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon. But I know we have a few just little loose ends here to wrap up with as some, final thoughts on it. And you have
Sure.
here, the antiquated depiction of technology, basically.
I absolutely love John Rainbird using the database and querying it for like the probability of whether or not Andy and Charlie, or whether or not Andy like has his powers and is using them on people. Just the idea in the 80s, like the things he asks it and how he uses it is an absolute delight to read in 2018. That was one of my favorite beats in the book, were those couple little bits. Like I really enjoyed that.
Even though it ages the book a lot, you don't really mind. You're like, oh, this is how things were
Right.
once upon a time. This is what technology was like.
Right. It's charming. It's like, oh, that's what in 1980, that's what they thought, like, mysterious supercomputers could do. Like, oh, okay, we can't do that now, but that's cool.
Absolutely. Are there any other little things you want to discuss real quick here?
Um, I guess not especially to me. I would close with yeah, I also enjoyed it. I remember enjoying it a little bit more when I was younger, but being a little more widely read and stuff now and understanding a little bit more about story structure and things. Yeah, I mean it's a good read. I would recommend it to any King fan. To me, it generally feels more like one of the Bachman books,
Okay.
but a lot of his early stuff does because it's so bleak. So, I mean, if you liked any of the Bachman books, I feel like it has a little bit in common with The Running Man, with the paranoia and the chase thriller. So, anybody who liked The Running Man, I'd recommend this. There's a lot to recommend it, but yeah, ultimately it's a flawed but entertaining read.
Yeah, well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Firestarter. You will definitely be back on the podcast. I know you
Hey,
have
thanks for having
you
me.
have a lot that you are also excited to discuss. So it'll be great to talk about these along the way because like I said, this is a process for me. So a lot of the things I will
Sure.
be reading for the first time. And that's definitely something I will be discussing on future episodes. Anything that I am reading or watching for the first time, that sort of always gives you a slightly different take on things. If I go
Absolutely,
back
yeah.
and rewatch it, for example, the remake, I probably won't feel exactly the same way I did the first time I was watching it, but I will probably still enjoy it quite a bit. So, rereading books is probably a thing that isn't really going to happen, though, just because, as you know, the books get very long. This is actually a pretty
Yes.
short one by Stephen King standards, and it's over 400 pages. So.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's hey, fresh takes here on Chat Cemetery.
Exactly. Well, to our listeners, as always, thank you all for listening. If you want to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so on iTunes or Google. It is available on both platforms, so it should be available on pretty much every single podcast app you can think of that you would use to listen to podcasts. It is also on YouTube. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Chat Cemetery. Give us a follow there. I'll be posting quite a bit. There's always Stephen King news coming out too, so there will be other discussions to have along the way. And thank you again for listening, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.